I'm delighted to be joined by Kevin from Netpol and Eveline from the Undercover Research Group. And today we're going to be talking about the remarkable changes that there have been to policing in the UK with the use of the new emergency powers. Kevin and Eveline have been doing an absolutely fantastic job of really acting as watchdogs on what the police have been doing and how they've been using their powers in the current crisis, and have a blog which I would encourage everyone to have a look at, which is called Policing the Corona State, which is updated every single day with coverage of what the police have been up to and how they've been using emergency powers, dispersing groups, sometimes targeting individuals, all sorts. And that's the kind of stuff that we're going to talk about today. And both Kevin and Eveline have a long history of fantastic work in this area. So Kevin, can you briefly introduce yourself first of all, please?
Yeah, so my job is as the coordinator for the Network for Police Monitoring, Netpol, which I've been doing for the last 5 years. I was one of the founders of Netpol back in 2009. And for 25 years, from the early 90s up until 2015, I was involved in a local police monitoring and racial harassment monitoring group in East London called the Newer Monitoring Project. And what Netpol does primarily is monitor two aspects of public order policing. One is the policing of protests and assemblies, and the other is the public order policing of local communities. So particularly stuff around stop and search, which was the kind of the way in that I got involved in Netpol back in 2009.
Great. And you've been working with Eveline on keeping an eye on policing in the UK over the past couple of months in particular. Eveline, it's great to meet you for the first time, by the way, on this Zoom call. I've been following your work with the Undercover Research Group for some time. Can you explain your work and your role and how you came into this?
I'm one of the founders of the Undercover Research Group, which basically looks at historical spying of activist groups, known sort of as the Spy Cop scandal, which first came to light when activists themselves found out they'd been infiltrated by Mark Kennedy, and more people found out that things had happened in their groups, and the Undercover Research Group has been set up to sort of collect that knowledge and that research tactics. And ever since, there is a public inquiry into undercover policing, we've been building a database of tactics and facts about these undercover officers, and also about the units they were part of, to find out how they were authorized and who were involved in that. And what we have found out is that there is a direct line between the thinking behind this, but also in person, in staff, between those units that spied on activist groups and the people who set up Prevent, and the people who are currently working on the database of domestic extremists. So that's where our work touches and overlaps, and that's how we've come to work together on this. And for the public inquiry that has been going on for like 5 years and was finally going to start its first public hearings in a fortnight, which of course now has been delayed by the corona crisis as well. I was looking into infiltration of the Black Power movement, of the anti-apartheid movies back in the 60s and 70s, and when the current crisis came up, I felt I had to do something more relevant today, which I don't say the other work isn't, but it suddenly felt like very far away. So that's how we came with the idea to set up this blog.
And it's such important work. The Spy Cop scandal in particular has to be one of the most egregious examples of British policing in modern times. So for those of us who are used to looking at examples of bad or dangerous policing in this country, It might be that some of what we've seen in this particularly extraordinary period of policing, for example, police acting outside of the law or being heavy-handed or lacking common sense, might not be a huge surprise to those of us that are used to working in this area, but now has come to enormous public consciousness, and you have the likes of ex-Supreme Court judges saying that we risk entering a police state. What do you think about those comments, and how realistic do you think that risk is? Or do you think it's just that people are now seeing a side to policing or feeling affected by policing in a way that they previously didn't?
Well, shall I comment first on this? Because I mean, I think that to a certain extent, the idea that we're living in a police state is kind of ignores that there were genuine issues that around policing that have been around for decades. I think what was particular, I mean, if you cast your mind back to the early part of when the lockdown was first introduced, there was, it seems like an age ago now, but I mean, it's important to remember that the Prime Minister and the government were actually really reluctant to go into this. They were dragged into implementing some form of lockdown arrangements by the public. But they started from a position, and certainly Boris Johnson articulated this, of saying, well, we understand that this is an enormous problem, and essentially we don't think that you're going to be able to deal with it. So Boris Johnson was banging on about the inalienable rights of people to be able to go to the pub. And I think that was a massive misreading of where public opinion was at that stage. But what it lent itself to was the police essentially adopting a position where they thought the government wanted them to go in really hard and impose the powers that they had, particularly at the beginning, in a really, really aggressive way in order to be able to send a message that the government didn't think the public could deal with this, but the state was ready to be able to respond in a very robust way. And that's why you saw all those fines in the first week being issued by forces like Lancashire. Right? It was about sending a message. And it was entirely the wrong approach, because there was genuine public support for the need for some form of public health regulations. But the police's approach of essentially treating the whole thing as though it was a public order matter, at a time when people were genuinely scared about themselves and their families, and whether people were who had underlying health conditions were going to survive, was a missed opportunity to be able to build some form of genuine consensus about how we collectively make sure that people didn't do things that might negatively impact on the need to protect people from the spread of a disease. And instead we had, snitch hotlines being set up, encouraging people to ring up the police and report on their neighbours. We had the use of the police powers in a way that was entirely arbitrary. And for us, certainly, in terms of the background of the work that we've done before, that was entirely predictable, because every time there's been the introduction of a new power that's intended to be used in a public order way, it's been abused. I mean, we can point to almost every piece of legislation, particularly ones that have been used against protesters and local communities going back for decades, where whatever the intentions may have been, those powers were was always used in a far more excessive way. And I think that it's taken, well, partly the publicity. I mean, it was, myself and Eveline, the work that we've done has been important, that was a recognition that we could see that this was going to happen. But it's also taken a public backlash where the police have just suddenly realised we got this wrong. We don't have the support of the public on this. And I think that has also been something which has been gradually fed back into the government as well.
Do you think they really do realise that they overstepped? I mean, I completely agree that the level of backlash towards the police has been, despite a history of abuses of power, has really been quite unprecedented, particularly to have from different quarters of society who don't normally criticise the police, who I guess feel that these powers actually now affect them as well as everyone else. and have been a bit more worried about the over-policing. Do you think there has been any kind of acknowledgement of that? And do you think there's any, Eveline, I wonder what you think about this. Do you think there is now any wider acknowledgement that for the police to abandon the rule of law is a dangerous thing?
Yes, I think I wanted to take one step back, because one of the things that happened, of course, was that there was a difference between the guidance that the government sent out and the actual laws that the police had to uphold. And in the first weeks, there was a continuing sort of discrepancy between those two, where the police were thinking they were doing the right thing and doing what the government told them, but they had no right. There was no law that they were upholding. So that gave a lot of sort of complications and fines that have been given that are now being ruled unlawful. Having said that, there's of course a continuum in the sense that what our impression is, and what we see in other countries as well, is that people who are always at the far end of more policing, more stop and search, black people, we have the impression that they are more of, they're being controlled more often, and there's many examples of that. However, there's no statistics about that yet.
It was only a few days ago. In fact, Kevin and I were just talking about this morning. Just a few days ago, the latest statistics on the fixed penalty notices show, in particular, almost the overrepresentation of Asian people receiving fixed penalty notice particularly stands out. It's really significant.
Yeah, we had one of our things in yesterday's entry is statistics from the States, where it says that 4 out of every 5 people who are stopped and searched are BAME people, black people, basically. We don't know. Well, it would be good to look into statistics in the UK to see if that is true, if our impression can be backed up by statistics. I do think, yes, that many more people are now at the receiving end of policing that they consider unfair for one reason or the other, and that there is a larger, like you said, a larger realization of how policing can go wrong. While, as Kevin says, there is a large, there's a willingness to oblige to the rules and to stay safe. And it's like you have to, it's like, instead of it being a joint public health effort, it's now you have to feel guilty with whatever you do. And of course, policing the parks, for instance, which has been a big issue over the last few weeks, and it will be again. Now the weather is getting better again. People don't seem to realize that people who use parks to be outside don't have a place don't have a garden or a place to be outside otherwise. Of course, there is a class difference and societal differences between people who complain about that and people who need those parks.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just in case anyone's not aware, what we're talking about here, the discrepancy between the guidance that was issued by the government and the laws that were put in place, also by the government without any parliamentary scrutiny, they were different. And so, for example, but then the guidance was enforced quite zealously by many police forces. So, for example, police were trying to enforce guidance like you can only exercise once a day, or you can't drive your car 5 minutes away, somewhere more quiet, secluded, to walk your dog or exercise. Even trying to police types of exercise. So we had examples of people being reprimanded by police for doing yoga because it's not proper exercise. Even in my local park, actually, there were police shouting at people who were doing strength exercises, saying, keep moving, unless you're running, you need to leave. And all this kind of stuff, let alone, there was this guidance around you should only go out to for shopping if it's for basic necessities. And you had some police officers, for example, searching people's bags, or I had an example of one person who was fined because she had gone out to buy a bottle of wine. And all this kind of stuff. And I think what's been quite worrying is, now that these embarrassing examples have come to light and more guidance has been issued by police chiefs, the CPS, and a lot of that guidance was quite good. It was certainly much clearer, reflecting what the law actually does say, regardless of whether you agree with it or not. There was some senior police figures who said, no, we prefer the guidance. Did that shock you guys as much as it shocked me?
I'm not sure it necessarily did, because, as I said before, although, primarily the lockdown has not even really been about trying to stop the spread of disease. It's about trying to slow it, right? But the police have treated it as, in absolute terms, as, if you do this, if you do yoga in the park, if you go out and buy a bottle of wine, you're killing people, right?
Yeah.
And that's always been nonsense, particularly at a time when, significant numbers of people have still had to go out to work. They've been policing the people who are, by and large, at home for most of the day and are going out for relatively short spaces of time. Why? Because it's easier to do that than to have to deal with the more complicated issue about the fact that there are companies allowing people who are to go to work who are definitely not physically distancing at all when they're at work, when there's insufficient facilities to make sure that they stay healthy. It's been the easy option. And I think one of the interesting things about the forces that have decided to be more aggressive, if you like, in relation to this is to the use of these powers, is that they have been rural forces. So there's been a real kind of we don't want outsiders coming into our areas. Now, I understand that there are arguments in some places, particularly in places like Cornwall, where their health services are already extremely limited. It's very good distances for people to be able to travel if they're sick. But the level of almost glee that the police entered into in relation to the use of those powers was about, this is an opportunity for us to be able to impose controls. And the reason why that wasn't such a great shock is because that is the pattern of public order policing as well. So the interesting thing about Dorset, for instance, which is, I'm sure other people have seen, has constantly articulated the idea that it's going to ignore public guidance and be much tougher because it needs to protect people coming into its county, is that Dorset has the highest disproportion of stop and searches of black people. Before the lockdown ever happened, you're 25 times more likely to be stopped in Dorset if you're black than if you're white, despite the black population in Dorset being absolutely tiny, right? And you can draw conclusions from that sort of response. That sort of, do you belong in this area? Do you belong in our county? Was an attitude that was definitely coming out from them and from North Yorkshire and a few others. Lancashire Police adopted a particularly aggressive response to lockdown measures at the beginning, which came as absolutely no shock to all the protesters that I know from Lancashire have been opposing fracking in that county, because they've seen the way that the public order policing in Lancashire is conducted. The Metropolitan Police has a long history of being the one force that massively dominates the statistics on stop and search. In the last month, there's been a 22% increase in the use of stop and search, despite the fact that huge numbers of the population are mainly stuck indoors. Why is that? That's because this is the way that they approach the control of people. the control of populations, the control of the way people go about their business. And it comes back to me is because people, they don't trust, they essentially see all of us as being potential criminals, as people who are potentially breaking the law, rather than people who are trying their best in really difficult circumstances to cope and look out for each other and so on. Evelyn and I were talking this morning, sharing some stuff about how policing of pandemics is the wrong approach, and particularly the police response to HIV, the HIV pandemic. That the response of criminalising people wasn't the solution that stopped the spread of that disease, and the police's involvement in this has been, from my view, has been overwhelmingly negative in terms of their contribution to ensuring that the spread of the disease has been slowed. I think that there have been more important things that they could have been doing and concentrating their resources on, in particular, the massive increase in domestic violence, but also, there have been other, crime has not stopped because most people have been indoors, but a lot of it has been robberies from premises and so on. What has been significant, I'm sure Evelyn would agree with this, is that the people that have been following some of the stuff that we've been doing are not our traditional audiences. They are definitely people who probably would have been quite scathing of some of the stuff we said about the police, 6 months ago, and have had I wouldn't quite call it a road to Damascus conversion, but certainly have realised that in a state of exception, which is what we've got now, it's not just going to happen to other people. It potentially can happen to you too, and that's something that that hopefully will be educational for people. I mean, I'm not sure that necessarily it will be, but I hope that it will be.
To go back to your question, that some police chiefs now say the guidance, we don't want the law, we'd rather have the guidance. I think it's more precise to say that there have been police chiefs that said this guidance is just getting too complicated. There's now so many examples in the guidance of what you can and what you can't do that it is not policeable. So they kind of warned, saying we can't do this. It would be good if they would if they would realize that this crisis is not about policing, that is in fact what they are saying, or that is what it should lead to, that this entire crisis is not about policing people off the streets, but it should be a joint effort to take care of each other. And it's a public health problem rather than anything else. And I'm sincerely hoping that people who say we can't police this guidance because it's too complicated, that they take a step further and say, yeah, well, this is not what it is about. And like Kevin said, this friends of ours are involved in construction site campaign. People, many non-essential construction sites have not even been shut all this time, while people are there without any security and any social distancing being possible at all. The police is not policing that. There's again, you come back to what is easy for the police and what is it's far too complicated and not what the government wants to go onto a construction site of a big corporate builder and send people home because they're too close to each other, which is in fact what you could expect them to do.
And I think that is part of what makes some, especially under the new regulations, they're difficult to enforce, both because I think previously it was relatively simple. Now it is incredibly complex, but also it kind of lacks common sense, I would argue. And so it's difficult for individuals to, I think, closely abide by the new rules, to be in that kind of state of cognitive dissonance, just knowing that you're going out to work on a construction site, but then and you're surrounded by people, but then you're only allowed to see one parent outdoors at a time. It just doesn't make sense. But it is also impossible to police, isn't it? The new rules. So the new rules essentially being that we're now allowed outdoors not only for exercise but for emotional and mental well-being. And we can meet one person from one other household at a time outdoors. That's essentially it, right? How do you think, we're just in the first few days of this, so we've no idea how this is going to play out. Can I encourage you to make a prediction? How do you think this will be policed?
Well, I can give an example. I live in the Netherlands, as you might hear. Here the advice is to, when you are outside, even with your household, with your family, keep distance, because the police can't see whether you're from the same household or not. So this is it shows that it's getting crazier and crazier if you want to stick to rules that are impossible to police. And then there is this other thing that there's, we still don't know what really causes contamination. And there's more and more evidence now that being outside is the best thing to do. That, if you're in school, in a contained, or in a care home where there's not enough ventilation, that's where people get contaminated, because the micro whatever bubbles stay in the air for much longer. So if that is going to be more common knowledge, it's going to be even harder to police outdoor spaces, I'm afraid.
I think the other thing is that just take this thing about the need to be able to go out for sort of emotional and mental well-being. Let's be absolutely honest. Nobody really needed the government to tell them that was important. You talk to people, people say, I need to go out, I need to get out of the house for a couple of hours. It wasn't just about keeping fit, it was about keeping sane. That's the conversations I've had with friends of mine all the time over the last 6 or 7 weeks. It was something that was entirely logical. And so the idea that we needed somebody to be able to tell us that suddenly this was okay was in some ways is just nonsense. That's part of the problem. They've tried to clarify to guide the guidance which is intended to be for the public, and the police have taken it as being guidance which is intended for them in the way that they approach their policing.
I think that's true, but the only thing I do worry about on that is that where the initial lockdown was so rigid and the kind of threats of policing were so rigid as well, I do know some people who either who haven't let their children out, for example, and I think that's because the level of fear is so high, and the expectation that we were going into this very rigid kind of policing environment and risk environment as well, that while some people will just always kind of make up their own minds, there are some people who will then kind of over self-police. And I guess that's also shown in some of the problems now faced with lifting the lockdown, is that some people can't really make sense of that shift.
I accept that, and I don't want to overstate that point, but I think it is important that actually much of what the vast majority of the public have done has been about exercising their own common sense, right? Yeah. So people have been afraid. There's no question of that, and I go back to what I said before. That in part was because so much about the approach to dealing with public health issues is about trust, and if your approach is to go in and articulate your messaging about a crackdown, then what tends to happen is that people don't trust the advice. They then decide that maybe things are worse, or they need to be more careful. And of course, that's because they were talking about their loved ones. I think the way that it will go in terms of the police's response, because I think there is a recognition that they're not in a position to be able to follow every aspect of this, or even make the kind of decisions that need to be made in anything other than an arbitrary way, if they follow the current guidelines, is the indications that we've seen from some of the reporting about information from the Home Office. So the Home Office is going to want the police to basically concentrate on large gatherings, and that doesn't necessarily mean large numbers of people gathering on Brighton Beach. It's going to be, some of the stuff we saw over this weekend in terms of targeting of house parties or raves or that sort of thing. And I still think that those are an exception at the moment. That the largest gatherings are people who gather together at work, but those are not going to be the issues that we really focus upon, because this is still about trying to find the criminal element out there, the so-called COVIDiots, and banging them over the head with public order legislation. So, but I think that's probably where it's going to go over the immediate time. That gradually people will go out. People, I think, will still exercise a greater degree of common sense, but the policing will focus far more on larger gatherings, with the exception of those parts of the country where they've decided that they're going to operate their own interpretation of these rules. The ones that we've already talked about.
What is the either worst or most absurd example of policing in the UK that you've seen in the last couple of months? You really are the best people to ask this question, because you've catalogued just about every single documented incident of bad policing. It's a stiff competition, but which do you think is the worst?
Oh God, put us on the spot. Eveline, you go first.
That's me.
Think back on some of the many examples.
This is like the Policing Raspberry Awards. We should send out some trophies.
Sorry, I missed that.
What do you think is the worst example? Or
the example. No, I think sort of the Easter egg discussion was kind of, where it has gotten to, like, what is essential shopping and are Easter eggs essential shopping, and then that got up to a level that sort of shows you how idiot the entire discussion is and the enforcement.
I would probably say that although there are some particularly sort of idiotic examples, I mean, you mentioned the one about people doing yoga in the park, and there's been other examples of police going and shouting at people sitting on a park bench on their own, when there is no question there being any kind of public health justification for that kind of action.
Wearing the wrong kind of trousers to someone who was wearing jeans, and that was not supposed to be fit for exercising. Sorry,
I'm glad I've completely forgotten about that one. That one was crazy. But to a certain extent, the answer is probably the decision of the police forces to issue fines like confetti in the first week. That is probably the maddest thing that they did, partly because it's looking increasingly likely there's going to be some form of legal challenge to the issuing of those fines. Silkie, as obviously you know very well. And if that happens, I think that many of the issue of those fines are going to be very difficult to justify, because I think it was entirely about sending a message rather than anything to do with any genuine form of disorder.
And even scores of unlawful prosecutions, which, again, some of this hasn't surprised me, but I have been really quite surprised to see not only the police charge people wrongly and under laws that kind of more or less don't exist, just a complete misinterpretation of the emergency powers, but then for that to go through the CPS and magistrates as well, that's been really, really worrying. But then some of what's happened has just been like a different level of absurd. And some of my favorite examples are the ones where individual officers, although well-intended, have really taken it upon themselves to kind of spread the lockdown message. And there was an example from Derbyshire Police in the first couple of days where a police officer just by himself drove his car down a residential street that was completely quiet and empty, and it was dark, and started blaring the sirens and shouting out on a loudhailer, "We need to beat Corona, stay inside, stay inside." And I guess it's kind of the visibility of this hopefully shows people that there has been at times a kind of, is it fair to say, neuroticism? There's been a bit of a kind of through the lens of policing, you know, that we can police the pandemic away like magic, and you know, it's been a kind of certain kind of craziness. And it's, I guess the one positive maybe is that this is now that how easy it is. I mean, in all of our areas of work, we often look at the ways in which policing oversteps the boundaries of the law, and I guess I hope now that that's been visible on a very, very mass public scale.
I think that's true, but I think the interesting, as well as those people for whom this has been a revelationary experience over the last 7 weeks, there have been an awful lot of people eye rolling and saying, "Well, finally, you've got it." So the failures of the courts, I mean, you're quite right. I mean, not only the police bringing those charges, but the CPS pursuing them and the courts allowing them people to be convicted on them is astonishing. But it's a real reflection of just how bad the criminal justice system has got in terms of being able to defend people's rights. You know, if you don't have a solicitor in those circumstances, then there's a real chance that you'll end up being wrongly convicted on a relatively minor offence in a magistrate's court. And that,
but worse still, even some of these people did. The teenager in Oxford who was charged under Welsh emergency powers for visiting his vulnerable mum had a solicitor, and we initially went to the solicitor's firm, you can look it up, and said, you know, very gently and privately said, you might want to have another look at this case because we've seen it and it's completely wrong. And very, very troubling kind of disregard for that young boy's life by just completely ignoring us and saying, no, we don't want to talk about it. And of course, then that's been that, you know, the only way that there's been remedial action there is through press coverage. But that is quite alarming.
But it's one of the reasons why, when we say to protesters, one of the 5 key messages that we put across to protesters is don't use a duty solicitor. Make sure you have a solicitor who knows what they're talking about. That's not because of the unusual times we're in now, but that's always been the case, that people are poorly served often by the representation that they get. And if they need to make sure that they have got representation in circumstances where things are different from the run-of-the-mill, a lot of cases are deal with Friday night drunks and so on, that you need to have somebody who knows what they're doing, and that clearly hasn't been the case in some of these other cases. As I said, I think the disproportionality issue that Eveline touched on earlier is going to be something which I think is going to be really fascinating to see in those figures when those figures begin to emerge. I mean, there is also some particular indications already that it's been young people who've been targeted far more. Although it's not necessarily young people who are far more likely to be out. And that's about some of the prejudices and the biases that were already there. But I think the racial profiling of some of this will become something that becomes more evident, because it is something that we have to go back to and talk about again and again in the other work we've had to do over the last decade or so. One of the difficulties about the figures that did come out that Eveline mentioned is, of course, that they're national figures, and Black and minority communities are concentrated in a relatively small number of areas in, you know, major cities, particularly London. I mean, half of the Black British population is in London, and we really need to know what's going on in those areas to be able to find this out. And I think it was a little bit disingenuous of the National Police Chiefs Council to kind of brush away, this is in keeping with the population demographics of these different communities. That's simply not true. And I think that's something that will be important for us to look at. And it has been an issue that I touched on before and this is much more about later on, as the lockdown begins to ease, what happens next, and about whether that kind of targeting and profiling becomes even more of an issue. And I'm thinking in particular about the powers to be able to detain somebody if they're perceived to be sick, in order to be able to take them away for testing, because that is something that I think is likely to become more of an issue over the next 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because we're almost, it's almost like in this initial kind of panic phase. We've got the regulations which are changing every few weeks and so on. But under the Coronavirus Act, there are some very, very long-lasting powers in there that confer huge, enormous, unprecedented powers on the police. For example, to detain people who are suspected of being infectious in unidentified quarantine locations, potentially, and to disperse gatherings as well. One of the concerns that we raised when this was rushed through Parliament in 3 days is that whereas under other emergency laws, there's been a lot of talk about a lot of questions raised about why wasn't the Civil Contingencies Act used. The Civil Contingencies Act, for example, still offers the safeguard that you can't use emergency laws to prevent strikes and industrial action. That safeguard doesn't exist under the Coronavirus Act. So really, in extremis, it could be used to completely take away protest rights, and gives very arbitrary powers to the police to detain people if abused, and which I do think is a real risk. And we were just talking just before this call about how what the political shift is going to be like after this, and in some ways, everything's up for grabs. We're already seeing these conversations emerge about radical environmental policies, and how we might enter a kind of new politics and try to shape a new society, which will mean activism as well. How do you think these worlds are going to collide, of police who have been empowered with extraordinary new emergency powers, a general kind of sense of risk and panic, and also a completely new political environment, and maybe a completely new kind of breed of activism and desire and appetite for social and political change?
Well, to start with, that new world starts today. The emergency powers that the police have been given, they need to be evaluated every 3 weeks in Parliament, and that has not happened one time yet. And that is, in and of itself, a danger to democracy, if you wish. Like if these powers are not being scrutinized, or not at this point in time, what's going to happen the next 2 years? That is. I'm amazed that there's not more protest from all kind of people about that.
Yeah, so the regulations have to be assessed as to whether they're still, the lockdown regulations have to be assessed as to whether they're still necessary and proportionate every 3 weeks. But we know nothing about that kind of evaluation. Nothing's given to Parliament, nothing given to the public.
Is it happening at all, you wonder? I don't think it does.
And then the other side of it is the alarming, increasing alarming direction of seeing this as being a war on the pandemic. And there's talk about biosecurity and the involvement of the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, officials from there in doing this COVID alert system. I think that there's definitely overlaps there, because if you're starting to see, if the approach is about increasingly around biosecurity and looking for potential threats to that biosecurity, then the same level of paranoia that we've seen from those people who are responsible for surveillance on alleged domestic extremists, for instance, for drawing up the kind of advice that pretty much brings every kind of social movement from C&D to Extinction Rebellion to all sorts of different people into sort of guidance notes that were, it seems like a decade ago now, but it was only in January that this was being talked about. coupled with, if that's the kind of messaging that the government is putting out, potentially the same kind of fears that drove people to ring up and report their neighbours for breaking social distancing, becoming people ringing up and reporting people they think may be infected still. You know, people are already talking about the prospects of a second wave and worrying about that. If it becomes, again, about seeing either those people who may be sick as being a threat, or those people who are talking about the needs to change the political discourse in relation to what's happened as being a threat, then that's basically a green light for not only maintaining the powers that are there, but using them in a far more sort of oppressive and potentially arbitrary way. So on the one hand, increasing the level of surveillance on anybody who is criticising the government's approach to the pandemic, and on the other hand, focusing in particular on those communities where there may be perceived to be an increased likelihood that people may still carry the infection. So, you know, those places, those communities where there's a high incidence of frontline workers. We've already seen an increasing level of race hate crimes against the Chinese community, or people perceived to be part of the Chinese community. Those two overlapping strands, I think, are really worrying. And of course, we've got another, 17 months of this to go before the legislation is supposed to end. And I think that kind of approach, that biosecurity approach, is the thing that really worries me, because I think it is exactly the kind of it stirs echoes and memories of what happened after 9/11 and after the 7/7 bombing in 2005. That kind of increasingly paranoid atmosphere that was genuinely scary for an awful lot of people, particularly those people who were critical of it.
Well, and I think the example you mentioned earlier, we talked about is the AIDS epidemic and the HIV. The communities that were particularly infected by HIV were policed very strongly at the beginning as well, and it took activism by people like from ACT UP and gay rights communities to for years to make clear that policing them away, policing them into the underground, or policing an epidemic like that in general is not the way to deal with illness. It's a public health thing, and the government needs to be open and needs to share statistics and share their findings, and the pharmaceutical industry has to, all the things that you kind of see happening again now, demands that we have to put forward. Maybe we should go back to ACT UP and the gay rights community to learn some lessons from there.
I also just want to add one other point, which is that Eveline's right. It was activism. It was people who were perceived to be at the margins at that particular moment, who pushed for changes in the approach that government adopted, and definitely are not at the margins anymore. They were seen to have been right. One of the interesting things, I had a conversation yesterday where somebody said to me, well, what's Netpol's priorities for the coming year? And I said, I don't know what the priorities are for the coming month, the way things are at the moment. We are going to have to be constantly reacting to the things that are happening, and we are going to have to be putting forward, potentially new solutions as campaigners across the board to the new circumstances we find ourselves in. And if in the course of that, there is a perception that is being seen as being potentially some sort of extremist threat, which is what has always been the case, that is really alarming, because that brings us back to the same level of intensive surveillance that we saw in the aftermath of the banking crisis. And it's the reason why we've been calling for the National Police Chiefs Council to abandon the domestic extremism label now. It needs to do it now, rather than the point where the lockdown happens and those debates are beginning to start.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's a completely useless and meaningless term that really broadly defines political dissidence, and has been used to instill fear and panic about people who criticize often people who criticize the government or don't fall within the confines of what was deemed to be acceptable thought by those in power, which is a very strange place for any democracy to be. So all the more power to you in both your work. I will greatly look forward to Big Brother Watch working with you during this period and seeing what comes next. I think you're absolutely right. There is going to be enormous political shifts after this, and there's been big policing shifts too. So this might be quite a challenging environment for activists, but I also love how you draw inspiration and lessons from activists that precede us, and it's never been more important, I think, than now and in the coming months, that there is a democratic swell and people have a say in what the kind of realigned world looks like. And I know you're going to play a huge role in protecting people as they do that important work. So on behalf of everyone, thank you. And also thanks for joining me today.